So, with this final chapter, we're going to close out the textbooks dealing with some big themes like the larger world economy. We're also going to be dealing with globalization of some issues like feminism, religion, just some larger scale elements to kind of, wrap up. Uh, Modern world history. So, to start off with here, throughout the 20th century, there's been a dense web of political relationships, economic transactions, and cultural influences that increasingly bound the world together. Um, this is something that we have been building since nearly the first chapter within this textbook. That we go from the various world zones being completely and totally isolated from one another to now in the modern era, them being tied together in so many different ways. By the 1990s, this process of accelerating engagement was known as globalization. Now, this really kind of kicks into overdrive from the 1990s on, but you want to put here next to number one that this began well before the 1990s. This began well before the 1990s. I mean, you see some element of this throughout the 1900s, especially after World War II, when the world kind of, especially the European powers, kind of realized that, in order to recover and then also succeed, we have to sort of kind of make and maintain these long-term connections and relationships. We need to be cooperative rather than being competitive. And globalization has a long history upon which 20th century globalization was built. You want to put down here next to number two, and I was kind of referencing this earlier, but you want to put down here that it began with the age of discovery. And then, of course, kind of similar to what I had just said earlier, that the pace of globalization increased rapidly after World War II. You want to put down here next to number three, again, this is kind of similar to what I had said before. Do you want to put down, please, interdependence, because of the interdependence created during World War II, the Cold War, and post war recovery. Again, one of the realities of the damage that was inflicted in World War II is that, parts of the world are not going to be able to go at this solo anymore, that they're going to need to integrate themselves into these larger networks rather than kind of being these isolated little pods. With this new concept of globalization, it's going to most commonly refer to international economic transactions. And this is kind of an important distinction. So you want to go ahead and put a star there by the unlabeled sentence. These global economic linkages are going to contract, they're going to shrink significantly in the first half of the 20th century, especially between the two world wars. And there's a reason for this. So you want to put down here next to number two, do you want to put down that this was the Great Depression? This was the Great Depression. Because remember, one of the elements of the Great Depression is that we have a decline in trade of any kinds, especially any type of international trade. Eventually, here, the capitalist winners of World War II were determined not to repeat the Great Depression. So, what they're going to do is they're going to put in a lot of stopgaps, a lot of safety nets, so to speak, to kind of prevent this type of catastrophe from happening again, especially immediately following World War II. So, the big one here that we have is the Bretton Woods agreements that occur immediately following World War II in 1944. And what I want you to put down, and this is kind of a big note because your notes here kind of skimp on some of the key elements of the Bretton Woods agreements. So next to A here, just want to put a heading, and we're going to run this down this side of the notes. You have plenty of space. And there's a couple like little things that we need to add, but you can easily add those over here to the right. So you just want to put a heading here next to A underneath 3. Just put down Bretton Woods agreements. And then there's 3 things. All right. The first is it established the World Bank. It established the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the International Monetary Fund, and actually put in parentheses IMF because you'll actually see that acronym more than you'll see International Monetary Fund. Second, it laid the foundation for post-war globalization. It laid the foundation for post-war globalization. And the third thing, the last thing, it promoted relatively free trade. It promoted relatively free trade, stable currencies linked to the US dollar, stable currencies linked to the US dollar, and high levels of capital investment, and high levels of capital investment. Besides just the Bretton Woods agreements, which is going to do a lot to contribute to globalization, technology is also going to help to accelerate this economic globalization. Um, I mean, here you end up having brand new technologies that are just going to make communication faster. In fact, you want to put down here next to B, and and obviously you don't have enough room over here on the left, so go ahead and tuck this over here on the right. It's not a very big note. You want to put down that the ability to communicate easier and quicker. The ability to communicate easier and quicker. I mean, if you think about it, before, like in the 1950s, in order to order something, you had to do so by catalog, you had to do so by mail. Well, now, flash forward to the 1990s and beyond, you're able to do it electronically, which means that the movements of goods and money in particular are going to nearly be instantaneous, or as instantaneous as we can have at this point. By the 1970s, major capitalist countries dropped many of the controls on economic activity, and they increasingly view the world as a single market. Now, this approach is going to be linked to a philosophical ideology from the 19th century, and this approach is going to better be known as neoliberalism. One of the elements of the 19th century classical liberalism ideology is this kind of complete and total notion of free trade. Where here, these neoliberals are going to favor a reduction in tariffs, which remember are taxes on imported goods, free global movement of capital, a mobile and temporary workforce, privatization of state enterprises, less government regulation of the economy, taxes, and also spending cuts. What they want to make sure is that money is able to move as freely as humanly possible. And you want to put down, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but you want to put down here next to B, again, going to have to squeeze this over here on the right-hand side. But again, this is a really small note. Do you want to put down that this is a throwback? This is a throwback to the 19th century. This is a throwback to the 19th century. It's sort of kind of just a modern version of what economically the classical liberals were thinking of. What also kind of helps this is the breakdown of communist state controlled economies. And this is going to be a big thing, especially after the 1990s, after 1989, when we see the end of the Eastern Bloc, and in the early to middle part of the 90s, when the Soviet Union finally, goes belly up as well. So you want to go ahead and put a star by D there. We definitely start to see global economic transactions quickened dramatically after World War II. Again, because of the level of destruction, we have to rebuild, and we have to rebuild very, very quickly. We're not going to be able to do so on our own. We're going to need to make these long distance economic connections. Because of this, world trade is going to absolutely skyrocket from 57 billion immediately after World War II to over 16 trillion in 2009. In fact, guys, this is going to be such a significant thing. Do you want to make sure that you go ahead and you put a star by number two? Central to this process of world trade are going to be transnational corporations, or TNCs, which are huge global businesses that operate in many countries simultaneously. There's also large numbers of workers, both laborers and professionals, have moved all over the world from poor countries to rich ones. So there's a lot of migration based upon economic availability and also based upon economic need. You want to put down here next to number six that this is especially the case. This is especially the case with places that had empire. This is especially the case with places that had empire. You see a lot of people within the former parts of empire going and leaving their homes and going to the mother country, like, for example, going and leaving India, for example, and going to England, or leaving a former African colony, English African colony, and going to England in search for work. Same thing is going to happen with, with the French, with the Germans, which with pretty much any European country that had some form of empire, at least, stereotypically. You also have a lot of people leaving their countries and going to the United States for some type of economic opportunity here as well. In addition to this, you also have millions more who are going to seek refuge in the West from oppression or civil war at home. World War II and the aftermath of World War II and the fall of Soviet communism is and even the fall of empire with decolonization is going to cause a lot of international political turmoil. And people will be leaving that turmoil and going to places of, less stress and also economic opportunity here as well. Others are going to migrate from developing to industrialized countries known as labor migrants. Again, this is where a lot of individuals are going to, say, the United States from Mexico or from Central America. Now, even though all of this increased global trade and the movement of labor and money and goods seems as though it's a good thing, there are going to be some issues with it. And in fact, it's this economic globalization that accompanied and maybe helped to generate the greatest economic growth spurt in world history, but it also creates an amazing amount of wealth, which is going to be good news and bad news. So you want to go ahead and you want to put a star here by number one, because this really is a mixed bag where we do have bonus. We have life expectancies rise nearly everywhere and infant mortality declines. Literacy rates are going to increase, so more people are going to be able to read, and there is a great decline with poverty. And again, these are going to be some key important figures, so you want to go ahead and put a star here. But there will be some problems. There will be a lot of divisions and wealth gaps as a consequence of this huge generation of wealth. You're going to see that it will not be evenly distributed. For one, you have a massive chasm or a massive gap between the developing or the developed, rich, industrialized countries and absolutely everyone else. And you want to put down here next to number three that the gap between the first world, and that means the industrialized countries, the gap between the first world and everyone else is growing. It's not just that it grew, it's that it continues to grow. So the gap between those countries that are industrialized and those countries that aren't, the wealth difference is going to be staggering. And it's this great disparity, this great difference has shaped almost everyone's life chances. You grow up in a first world nation, you have far greater chances of survival and success than you do if you're in the developing world. These growing disparities have become a great source of conflict between the richer global north and the developing global south. These growing disparities between these developing countries make collective action more difficult. They can't work together in order to overcome some of these differences because one country's differences aren't necessarily another's country's differences. And because they're so in the hole, because they're so deep in this stage of development, trying to work together and create any type of a coordinated effort is going to be very, very difficult, if not in some cases, just simply downright impossible. On top of this gap between the wealthy countries and the poor countries, there's also growing economic inequality within individual states, both rich and poor. This is not something that is only going to be occurring within those developing countries in the global south. Like, for example, in the United States, there has been a loss of millions of manufacturing jobs, forcing factory workers into low paying jobs while others are going to prosper in high tech industries. Like, for example, you have in Michigan, in the surrounding Detroit area, a huge number of people that have lost well paying manufacturing jobs. And you have just this economic disaster that is Detroit and the surrounding areas versus anywhere where you have a tech boom, going and simply flourishing with these high paying tech jobs. There's also a growing popular movement against this globalization that also is going to emerge during the 1990s when this globalization is really taking off. And again, it involves people from both rich and poor countries. It's not going to be isolated only in first world or only in third world nations here as well. And the basic argument they make is that free trade, market driven corporate globalization is going to lower labor standards, encourage ecological destruction, and also ignored human rights, local cultures, and also enhanced global inequality. What I need you to do here next to B, you want to put a star here by B to begin with. And then you also want to add here, over here on the left, you want to put down that the bad news of globalization is that it equals exploitation. The bad news of globalization is that it equals exploitation. A lot of this anti-globalization sentiment, especially this coming from the global community, is really going to be targeted towards the United States. Because for many, opposition to a corporate free trade globalization equals opposition to the growing US power and influence in the world. You want to go ahead and also put a star there by number one here as well. For a lot of people, this growth of US economic power is often seen as as an American empire. That this is, rather than a political empire, this is going to be one that's going to be economic as well as cultural. Most Americans, of course, are going to deny that America is an empire. Um, and again, it's not going to be a political empire. It's not going to be like those empires that we talked about for two chapters, a couple chapters ago. Instead, you want to put down here next to B underneath number one that this is an economic and cultural empire. And again, perhaps it's best described as an informal empire, like those exercised by Europeans in China and the Middle East in the 19th century, where we don't have direct influence over them. It's going to be more indirect, kind of passive influence. Because let's face it, you know, find me a country that doesn't have like a McDonald's, or doesn't have Coca-Cola products or Pepsi products, or doesn't show um, American TV, or doesn't have American music infiltrating some element of their lives. What also is going to help this along is the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War leaves the United States without any equivalent power in opposition. So, this is going to be a real contributor to this notion of an American empire. So, you want to go ahead and put a star there by number two. The United States ultimately here is going to be facing growing international economic competition since the 1980s. Um, And realistically, you want to put down here next to three, you can probably fit it in this little gap because it's not a very big note. Do you want to put down that this was seen before this? This was seen before this. In fact, as soon as West Germany goes and recovers economically, they tend to be a very substantial economic competitor to the United States. Just to give you an idea of the difference that we're having immediate post World War II versus something a little bit more current in the 1980s, the US share of the overall world production was about 50% immediately following World War II in 1945. However, by the time we get to the 1980s, it's going to drop to 20% or around 20%. Now, some of this is because the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States is providing a lot of the world production because the European production has been destroyed as a consequence of World War II. You also have decolonization contributing into that. And by the 1980s, you have a lot of these former colonies stepping up as major economic powerhouses, as well as the rebuilding of a lot of the European markets here as well. As a result of this, there's also going to be a sharp reversal in US trade balance, where US imports, meaning that we're buying goods, is going to far exceed its exports, what we're selling goods here as well. The other thing here that's going to be important to note, and you want to put this down next to A underneath number three, you want to put down that this shows a shift. This shows a shift away from manufacturing. The United States will start to pick up in other industries, like service industries will also pick up in the growing tech industry here as well in the 1980s and also early in the 1990s as well. The global exercise of American power is also has also caused controversy within the United States. And two big ones here is the Vietnam War, which is going to split the country worse than anything since the Civil War. And then also the US invasion of Iraq is going to produce similar protests and controversies, not only within the United States, but also outside the United States. Before we flip here to the next page or to the next section, you want to go and put a little star here by number five as well.